Years before the Norfolk Southern unveiled its 20 heritage diesels to the world in 2012, and before the Union Pacific had its 6 heritage locomotives before that, the Canadian Pacific had its own heritage fleet in northeastern Pennsylvania. Fitting, since the Delaware and Hudson was the product of the very first rail ventures in America. Its original Penn Division main line, which ran through Carbondale, Pennsylvania to Nineveh, New York, and east to Albany, was abandoned in favor of the ex-Lackawanna line, which runs from Taylor Yard north to Binghamton and east to Oneonta and Albany and north to Montreal, Quebec in Canada. At least 2 EMD Jeeps were repainted in the D&H's famous blue and gray lightning stripe livery that was not only one of the sharpest paint schemes in the region, but was also a favorite among many rail fans. Units number 7303, which had gold lettering, and number 7312, which had blue lettering, like the D&H itself, operated in relative obscurity when compared to the waves made by the announcement of UP's and NS's heritage fleets. And now, as CP has long since departed northeastern Pennsylvania for good and took what was left of the original D&H with it, we get a glimpse of a railroad that not only survived in an era when most of its neighbors were collapsing into Conrail, but also a legacy of a bridge line that now serves 2 masters.
3, 2, 1, go!
Delaware and Hudson Alcos marched by the Main Street crossing in Moosic, Pennsylvania, elephant style in this circa 1980 photo. The trackage in this photo was also used by the Central Railroad of New Jersey between Hudson and Minooka Junction to reach its station and terminal in Scranton. Once the Erie and the Lackawanna also used this trackage, but when the Erie and the Lackawanna merged in 1960, Erie trains no longer needed to use this route, using instead the former Laurel line from Wilkes-Barre to Scranton, with trains moving to Binghamton or to New Jersey using the former Lackawanna main line. Over on the NS-D&H Sunbury line, there's a small group of locomotives that have been given a heritage status that's unique to this historical railroad. I call them the D&H class. And although the D&H is no longer with us in northeastern Pennsylvania, for a time afterward its memory and legacy lived on in a handful of black and white diesels with decals that paid tribute to the past. Unfortunately, the D&H Class SD40-2s were also part of the Blackboard Brigade, and all, if not most, were retired in 2020. Welcome back to the channel to all of my regular viewers, and welcome to the channel to any newcomers to the group. Norfolk Southern finally released its Delaware and Hudson Heritage Unit, the one that I've been waiting a lifetime for, and for more reasons than one. Having grown up with and on the D&H, this locomotive obviously couldn't come fast enough for me. With this video, I can proudly say that my personal documentary of the railroad that we knew as the bridge line to New England and Canada can finally be concluded. This journey began for me in the 1970s, when the train still had cabooses and before Conrail. Yes, I'm that old. Before the Stackers Act and the streamlining binge of the 1980s, before the super mergers of the 1990s, before the Canadian invasion of the 2000s, and before the precision scheduled railroading of the 2010s, I can personally look back at all of the things that the bridge line has meant to me over the years. We'll all miss it, but change is often inevitable. I mean, Kodak just went out of business after over 100 years in service. But hopefully the future generations can watch these videos and understand why we cherish the Delaware and Hudson and all of the fallen flag railroads of America the way that we did. And if you'd like to learn more about the Delaware and Hudson and the many other aspects of American railroading, check out the videos on this channel. I've arranged them into special playlists so you can easily find what you're looking for. The playlists that I suggest the most are The History of Railroading in Northeastern Pennsylvania, The Last Days of Canadian Pacific in Northeastern Pennsylvania, the Time Capsule series, and The Last Days of NS and CSX. As you've probably heard, Union Pacific is planning a takeover of the Norfolk Southern. When it happens, The BNSF and CSX will have to plan their own corporate pairing, which will beg the question as to what the Canadian National is going to do. Ironic, since it was the Canadian National under the leadership of Hunter Harrison that triggered this final round of railroad supermergers with their attempt to partner with the BNSF back in 2001. Harrison ushered in his PSR philosophy and then tried to acquire CSX and NS for the Canadian Pacific in 2014 and 2015. After Harrison's departure from CP for CSX in 2017, Harrison protege Keith Creel continued looking for acquisitions and took over the CMQ, that's the Central Maine in Quebec, in 2019, and announced CP's intention to take over the Kansas City Southern in 2021, but faced fierce blowback from the Canadian National. Following a 2-year tug-of-war by the Canadian Class 1s, KCS finally accepted CP's $31 billion buyout offer over the CNs, and on March 15, 2023, the Surface Transportation Board approved the CPKC merger. On Friday, April 14, 2023, CPKC began operations, which brings us to today. I'm working on a video that chronicles the many railroad mergers starting from the 1950s. For now, each of the playlists that I've mentioned focuses on a specific time period that overlaps the playlist before it. For example, the history of railroading in northeastern Pennsylvania pretty much covers the time from when the D&H was incepted to 1999 when Conrail was chopped in half like a pizza. The last days of CP in northeastern Pennsylvania covers from 1991 when CP first came into the region to when it left in 2015, and that includes the ill-fated St. Lawrence and Hudson. The Time Capsule series is a straight line from 2014 up to August 7, the date that this video was primarily recorded. And good news, if you like Dash 9s, you'll see hundreds of them in the Time Capsule series. The last days of NS and CSX begins from August 8th to whenever the takeover happens. Lastly, other great sources of Northeastern Railroad history are the following organizations: the Lackawanna and Wyoming Valley Railroad Historical Society, the Central Pennsylvania Railroad Historical Society, the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Historical Society, the Conrail Railroad Historical Society, the Penn Central Railroad Historical Society, and the Anthracite Railroad's Historical Society. And with that now, we move on to the video. Looking across the valley, it's another typical morning in Scranton, Pennsylvania. To the left of our vantage point, a Norfolk Southern manifest is making its way out of town. To the right, we see the Delaware Lackawanna doing its thing in Steamtown with a long-time heritage unit and a newly painted one. Delaware Lackawanna RS3 number 4068 is the last of 3 former Delaware and Hudson RS3s that the DL previously had on its locomotive roster. Delaware Lackawanna sold the 4103 and 4118 to the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson Railway. Both were built in 1952 and were purchased secondhand from the Octorara Railroad, rebuilt by GVT at their South Scranton shop, and served on the Delaware Lackawanna Railroad in general freight service here in Scranton. The best part was that instead of the usual GVT corporate paint scheme of white and gray, the RS3s were painted black with yellow safety stripes and lettered in a way to represent their as-built appearance on the D&H. According to the railroad, recent acquisitions of additional motive power had relegated these locomotives to standby status. The Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson was launched in 2022 and currently operates passenger trains over a scenic portion of the former D&H Adirondack branch. With the growing success of the new tourist attraction under the leadership of their president, Hal Raven, heavier locomotives with additional pulling power were needed. The RS3s are a perfect fit, providing additional horsepower, ease of operation, and most importantly, returning the two vintage locomotives to track which they formerly called home. Because of their historic nature, we would not sell these locomotives to just any operator, said David Montverde, chairman of the GVT rail system. We feel the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson will give these locomotives a good home and maintain their historic status well into the future. They are in good hands. Locomotives 4103 and 4118 both wore the same numbers with the Delaware and Hudson. The Genesee Valley Transportation Company operates 5 railroads in New York and northeastern Pennsylvania and is now the sole American operator of Alco and Montreal Locomotive Works 6-motor diesels, with at least 4 active. The company's roster also includes 5 M636 locomotives acquired from the Western New York and Pennsylvania and a recently acquired former Canadian National MLW M420, giving it an active fleet of 3 of those units. The GVT also made headlines in preservation circles when it acquired the Alco PA locomotive owned by preservationist Doyle McCormack to run the unit on mainline passenger excursions and office car specials. There was a gala welcome event when it was delivered to the Delaware Lackawanna yard here at Scranton. The locomotive began life as Santa Fe No. 62L, built in December of 1948. It was one of 4 PA-1s sold to the Delaware and Hudson in 1967 for use on the railroad's New York, Albany, Montreal passenger service, retaining the war bonnet paint scheme but with the D&H blue replacing the Santa Fe red. Number 62L became number 18. The units became expendable when the Albany-Montreal route was not included in Amtrak in 1971, and all 4 were shipped away, with 2 leased to Steam Tours Incorporated of Akron, Ohio, and 2 traded into General Electric for new units during a period when Erie-Lackawanna management was essentially overseeing the D&H. But under President C. Bruce Sturzing, the railroad reclaimed the 4 PAs. The tour company was behind on lease payments, and the planned purchase of new GEs had fallen through, and eventually used them when Amtrak restored Albany-Montreal operations. During this period, all 4 locomotives were rebuilt by Morrison Knudsen with their 2,000 horsepower 244 prime movers replaced by 2,400 horsepower 251 engines. The rebuilds were dubbed as PA4s. They again became expendable when Amtrak began using Rohr turboliner train sets on the route, and after brief periods in freight service and on lease to the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, they were sold to Mexico in 1978. In 2000, the shells of the 2 locomotives, which was all that remained of them, were returned to the U.S. with the help of the United States and Mexican governments and the Smithsonian Institution. 1 shell is under restoration at the Museum of the American Railroad in Texas. McCormack acquired the other and restored it as the Nickel Plate Road number 190. Upon arrival, the engine went to the GVT's Von Storch locomotive shops, again here in Scranton, to determine what needed to be done and to make it operational. Founded in 1985, the Genesee Valley Transportation System operates a 1,318-mile network of 5 subsidiary railroads in New York and Pennsylvania. And despite the builder ending domestic diesel production in 1969, the GVT remains one of the largest operators of Alco diesels in regular revenue service in America. One thing most of the hard anthracite coal railroads had in common in their early diesel years were their black or lack of colored locomotives. As the second generation of the diesel locomotives came in, many began to brighten up their liveries with an array of color schemes. Roads like the Delaware and Hudson with its dark blue and later dynamic lightning stripe blue and gray, the Redding's dark green and later green and yellow, including the rare Beeline service slogan on the sides, and the eccentric Lehigh Valley, whose exotic and varied paint schemes seemingly sampled every color from the rainbow. All of that changed in 1976 when every railroad's color became blue. On Friday, August 28, 2015 at 07:35 a.m., While most people were still asleep, commuting to jobs, or eating breakfast, Canadian Pacific Train 458 came down the line and into Taylor Yard with an unexpected hometown hero. The 7303 represented one of the last of the Mohicans when it came to the area, and the fact that it came to town for one last hurrah just 2 weeks before the resignation of Canadian Pacific of the D&H South lines is far from happenstance. The historic Jeep worked local service on its southern end right up until the last day of September 18, 2015, when the EMD made its last run out of the valley and northeastern Pennsylvania, ending more than a century of service. In an odd sort of way, it seemed almost poetic that the lucky and lonesome Jeep made its last run to Binghamton, New York, long hood forward, as if it were looking back on the railroad and the communities that it served. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company was incorporated in 1823 to construct a canal between the Delaware River and the Hudson River to transport anthracite coal to New York City. The ground was broken for the D&H Canal in July 1825, and the canal opened between Rondout Creek near Kingston, New York, and Honesdale, Pennsylvania in October of 1828. To obtain anthracite coal, the D&H constructed the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad in the Moosic Mountains near Carbondale between 1826 and 1829. Towards the late 1800s, the D&H realized that railroads were the future of bulk transportation, and the company began investing in stock and trackage. The canal carried its last loads of coal in 1898 and was subsequently drained and sold. The Jefferson Railroad was chartered in 1864 with the goal of constructing a line between Carbondale and the Erie Railroad's main line at Lanesboro. The line was financed and constructed by the Erie Railroad in 1869 through 1872. In return for gaining trackage rights over the D&H's Gravity Railroad, the D&H gained trackage rights over the Jefferson Railroad, providing an important connection to Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. The line was extended north to Nineveh, New York, to form the D&H's 93-mile-long Pennsylvania Division, which halted primarily anthracite coal from the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys in Pennsylvania to markets in upstate New York, New England, and Canada. In 1964, the Norfolk and Western wanted to acquire the Wabash and the Nickel Plate Railroads. The Interstate Commerce Commission informed them that to purchase the two roads, they would also have to purchase the Erie-Lackawanna and the Delaware and Hudson. This is a scenario that preceded the Penn Central one in 1968. Both were placed into Dureco, a holding company owned by the N&W. After the Hurricane Agnes destroyed much of the Erie-Lackawanna main line west of Binghamton, New York, and following the bankruptcy of numerous railroads in the 1970s, including the Erie-Lackawanna and the D&H, the Norfolk and Western lost control of the Dureco stock. Erie-Lackawanna petitioned for and was included in the formation of Conrail, while the D&H was allowed to become an independent railroad. In 1980, Conrail sold the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western main line from Binghamton, New York to Scranton, Pennsylvania to the Delaware and Hudson. As it was a much more flat and direct route to Scranton, the D&H opted to abandon the Pennsylvania division between Carbondale and the connection with the Erie-Lackawanna at Brant, just east of Lanesboro, in 1982. The remainder of the Pennsylvania division from Brant to Nineveh Junction, New York was used for overheight vehicles, often carrying massive steam turbines from General Electric's Schenectady facility. But the remainder of the Penn division was too abandoned after the Belden Hill Tunnel was enlarged in 1986 on the D&H Susquehanna division between Binghamton and Schenectady, which allowed the D&H to route traffic over the ex-Erie-Lackawanna trackage from Jefferson Junction northward. The only Pennsylvania Division trackage that remains in use today is from Carbondale south through the towns of Mayfield, Peckville, Archibald, and Dixon City. It's owned by the Pennsylvania Northeastern Regional Railroad Authority and is operated by the Delaware-Lackawanna Short Line. Significant portions of the Delaware and Hudson Penn Division between Simpson and the New York State Line have been converted into the Delaware and Hudson Rail Trail. The abandoned 1904 Staruka Creek Bridge, not to be confused with the Erie Railroad Staruka Viaduct in Lanesboro, was renovated for use by pedestrians, cyclists, and horseback riders in 2019 through 2020. The project was funded by the Pennsylvania Recreational Trails Program, the Federal Highway Administration, and the State Bureau of Recreation and Conservation. CPD&H GP38-2 number 7312 rounds the curve at Yatesville, Pennsylvania in this 2004 photo. And besides the flashy little Jeep leading its train up and over the hill, also worthy of mention in this photo are the green newsprint boxcars in the background and that 15-mile-per-hour street sign that's still on the job over 20 years later as I record this video in 2025. When the Canadian Pacific took over the D&H in 1990, both railroading and the world were completely different than it was when it sold the line 25 years later. Back then, CPD&H trains looked different because they were different. Paper and products that support the paper-making industry made up the majority, or at least a good part of, the trains that rolled over the line during that time. Northbound, there was Kalen cars from the southeast, both hopper cars and tank cars, with a parade of names like Georgia Kalen, Engelhard, J.M. Huber, and even Sandersville. And this is when Sandersville still spelled out the name across their hopper cars. Southbound, there was an endless parade of boxcars that carried paper of all types, but the most common boxcar, at least during that time, was the CP newsprint boxcar, just like the one you see here. Besides their green color, the newsprint boxcars were distinguishable by the Canadian Pacific shield with the words newsprint service only on the side. This is a powerful throwback to the 20th century and the days before digital technology, specifically the internet, rendered most forms of printed media obsolete. The Delaware and Hudson originates from an 1823 New York State Corporation charter listing the president, managers, and company of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, authorizing an establishment of a canal linking the Delaware River and the Hudson River. Nicknamed the Bridge Line to New England and Canada, and also called North America's oldest continually operated transportation company, the Delaware and Hudson connected New York State with Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and New England. In 1991, the Canadian Pacific Railway, now the CPKC, purchased the D&H and operated it under the U.S. subsidiary of the Soo Line Corporation. On September 19, 2015, NS completed the acquisition of the 282-mile D&H South Line from CP. The South Line connects Schenectady, New York, along with the Binghamton, New York terminal and its Pan Am Southern route to Ayer, Massachusetts, with Sunbury, Pennsylvania, and it consists of two rail lines, the Sunbury Line and the Freight Line. The Nicholson Cutoff, sometimes called the Pennsylvania Cutoff, is located on the Sunbury Line just north of Scranton, which was the former main line of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. There she is. Sure is pretty. One of the most handsome locomotives on rails, and without a doubt, my favorite heritage unit ahead of the Reading, the Virginian, the Pensy, and Miss Connie. So take notes. Norfolk Southern unveiled the SD70 ACE, honoring the Delaware and Hudson Railway in May of 2025. Locomotive number 1080, built for NS in 2013, was painted in the D&H's classic lightning stripe scheme in Norfolk Southern's Juniata shop in Altoona, Pennsylvania. I personally can't help but to wonder if the number of the locomotive chosen correlates with the fact that the D&H took over the Lackawanna main line to Binghamton in October of 1980. Whether it does or not, many people had asked about plans for a Delaware and Hudson Heritage locomotive, and thanks to help from the Delaware and Hudson Railway Historical Society, as well as the top-notch Juniata shop railroaders, the new Heritage locomotive made its debut at an employee event before hitting the track and will serve as the leader when NS operates their first train on the new trackage rights in New England in December, running on a historic Delaware and Hudson route between Delancey and Voorheesville, New York. NS is planning to shift its daily Chicago to Ayer, Massachusetts intermodal train to trackage rights on the CSX between Voorheesville, New York and Worcester, Massachusetts, then up the former Pan Am Railways to the Ayer terminal on the Pan Am Southern. The train currently uses the former D&H between Binghamton and Mechanicville, New York, where it is then handed off to the Pan Am Southern operator Berkshire and Eastern, a Genesee and Wyoming short line formed after CSX acquired the Pan Am Railways and its 50% ownership stake in Pan Am Southern in 2022. The new route via the former Boston and Albany can accommodate domestic double-stack trains, something the current route via the former Boston and main line through the 4 3/4 mile Hoosac Tunnel in western Massachusetts cannot. The trackage rights deal with CSX was reached as part of Norfolk Southern's agreement, I call it extracting a pound of flesh, to support its rival's acquisition of Pan Am Southern. Norfolk Southern holds the other 50% stake in the Pan Am Southern. Final bridge clearance work is underway on the former Pan Am Railways between Worcester and Ayer. On August 7, 2025, train H60 came up the line with the 1080 on the point in perfect morning light. And in addition to the sought-after Heritage, this is to date the biggest train that I've ever recorded, as well as what I believe to be the biggest D&H train ever run over the line. This oversized giant is almost 15,000 feet long. 14,885 to be specific. It weighs in at a whopping 15,000 tons and has 253 individual cars and buckets. I counted. And in addition to the lightning-striped celebrity up front, the Savannah and Atlanta Heritage Unit number 1065 is the trailing DPU, giving this train a rare but well-deserved Heritage locomotive duo. It took this nearly 3-mile-long land barge more than 12 minutes to pass our location. I give it to you now from multiple camera angles and without interruption. Turn it up or turn it down, whichever suits your fancy. I give you the train, the whole train, and nothing but the train, as well as some hilarious radio scanner chatter along the way. Enjoy.
Project marker, CP672, have a good day, guys.
Now for the camera.
Oh, yeah. Smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave. Oh, God.
south on the east side, north, steambound south, over.
Roger, good marker. Take it.
2 mile away.
The Delaware and Hudson bought 16 U-23Bs. Number 315 was wrecked before it could be renumbered, leaving the number 2315 open on the D&H roster. The Western New York and Pennsylvania, the WNYMP, RS3U number 406 was originally built in 1952 by Alco as a model RS3 for the Delaware and Hudson Railroad with the number 4112. It was rebuilt in 1976 by Morrison Knudsen into a 2,000 horsepower RS3M RS3U unit, becoming one of 8 D&H RS3s so modified. During its time with the D&H, it was designated as a bicentennial unit and wore a special paint scheme. Only the 506, as the 1976, was painted red, white, and blue. All of the other RS3Us were delivered by the Morrison Knudsen in the attractive gray, yellow, blue lightning striped scheme. The locomotive was later assigned to the Tioga Central Railroad before moving to the Western New York and Pennsylvania Railroad, where it was renumbered to the 406. In July of 2023, the locomotive was acquired by the Arcade and Attica Railroad from the WNYMP and was renumbered to 114, where it is now used primarily for freight service between Arcade Junction and the Rysdorf Brothers Mill in North Java, New York. It would have been ironic if it had ended up in the hands of the Delaware Lackawanna. Long after the Delaware and Hudson ceased to be an independent railroad, heritage paint schemes continued to show up. On the Saratoga and North Creek, a rare GE B39-8 number 8524 sports the iconic blue and gray lightning stripe scheme of the D&H. It became the Fillmore and Western, that's reporting mark FMWX, where it is shown here on April 16, 2023 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It came down the line dead in tow on Train 11Z in December of 2024. In addition to the 8524, other Saratoga North Creek locomotives, namely EMDs, got the same D&H touch of class, like X-Banger and Aroostook EMD BL2 number 52 and also number 56, along with EMD number 411 and X-Amtrak F40PH. The Southern New England Railroad is often called the Titanic Railroad due to its main architect, who sadly went down with the RMS Titanic in April of 1914. Today's Southern New England Railroad is a New England short line with Alco RS-36 number 5012 paying tribute to the Delaware and Hudson. Constructed in 1962 as the Atlantic and Danville number 2, the locomotive operated under several owners, including the Norfolk, Franklin, and Danville, the Danville Delaware Valley Railroad, and the Delaware Coastline Railroad before being purchased by the Southern New England Railroad in 2018. I caught it being transported through the area dead in tow on a snowy winter's day on February 2, 2020, behind a big lash-up of Norfolk Southern power. The Delaware and Hudson was one of the most historic transportation companies in North America. Originally conceived to bring coal from northeastern Pennsylvania to tidewater on the Hudson River, the D&H Canal became an important transportation link that contributed to the economic and population growth of the regions that it served. Construction on the canal began in Batesburg, New York, later renamed Summitville, on July 13, 1825, and the full route from Rondout, just south of Kingston, New York, to Honesdale, Pennsylvania, was opened to navigation on October 16, 1828. Realizing that the canal's survival depended on a reliable way to funnel traffic to its ports, the D&H chartered the 4-foot 3-inch gauge Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad to bring anthracite coal from the mines near Carbondale, Pennsylvania, to the canal at Honesdale. Construction was authorized on April 8, 1826, and on the first stretch of track built west from Honesdale, the Stour Bridge Line made the first run of a locomotive on rails in the United States on August 8, 1829. From Carbondale, the railroad was built westward in stages, reaching Scranton in 1863. Meanwhile, through a series of acquisitions of smaller railroads and new construction to connect them, the first D&H standard gauge railroad line reached north from Carbondale to Albany, New York, and opened on October 28, 1870. Additional mergers, acquisition, and construction brought the northern terminus of the standard gauge line to the Canadian border at Rouse's Point, New York, on November 29, 1875. The completion of the largely parallel New York and Erie Railroad on May 14, 1851, made the D&H Canal an obsolete transportation method just 23 years after its opening. After several decades of decline, the last boat traversed the D&H Canal on November 5, 1898, making the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company exclusively an operator of railroads. The gravity railroad that once fed the canal was reduced to passenger service only, and it subsequently closed on January 3, 1899. By January 22nd, the former gravity railroad from Carbondale to Scranton had been converted to standard gauge to be used along the rest of the system, and the D&H's acquisition of trackage rights on the Lehigh and Susquehanna Railroad brought the southern end of the line to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. This created a total main line route of 744 miles from Wilkes-Barre, where I grew up, at its southern end, to Rouse's Point, not including branches or secondary lines. On April 28, 1899, the company name was changed to the Delaware and Hudson Company to reflect the lack of any remaining canal-related operations. The D&H purchased the 31-mile Greenwich and Johnsonville Railway in 1906 and the 29-mile Napierville Junction Railway on April 9, 1907. The latter line gave the D&H a direct connection from the Canadian border at Rouse's Point to St. Constant Junction in Delson, Quebec. This made the D&H the shortest and fastest route from Albany, New York to Montreal, bringing in a significant amount of international bridge traffic to the railroad. Additional bridge traffic was routed via the D&H from points west to reach the Boston and Maine at the D&H interchange in Mechanicville, New York. The Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railroad, jointly chartered in 1912 by the D&H and the Pennsylvania Railroad, opened on March 29, 1915, to provide a new connection between the two lines that provided even more bridge traffic via nearly the entire length of the D&H. By the late 1930s, the company began branding itself as the Bridge Line to New England and Canada, reflecting the D&H's status in the North American Railroad network. Due to its location, roughly at the midpoint of the line, Albany had been selected as a logical home for the company as early as 1890, when a large D&H office building was constructed on the corner of North Pearl and Steuben Streets, which is still extant today. As the railroad and the staff grew, the D&H's new and now iconic headquarters building was constructed along State Street between 1914 and 1918. Prosperity followed, and 97 new businesses located along the D&H in the railroad's centennial year of 1923. The railroad's success led the D&H to consolidate its rail operations, incorporating the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Corporation on December 1, 1928, and transferring all of its rail property to the new wholly owned subsidiary corporation on April 1, 1930. In addition to the railroad, the parent Delaware and Hudson Company continued to own the Greenwich and Johnsonville Railway, the Napierville Junction Railway, and a variety of other related holdings such as the Hudson Coal Company. The D&H's last major route expansion occurred on January 1, 1955, with the purchase of the Erie Railroad's 34.6-mile Jefferson branch from Carbondale to Lanesboro, Pennsylvania. This line had been constructed jointly by the D&H and the Erie just after the Civil War, and the D&H's trackage rights on this branch had allowed it to connect its gravity railroad in Carbondale with its own line from Lanesboro to Albany in 1870. The D&H's purchase of the former Erie line solidified the connection of the D&H's existing routes from Wilkes-Barre to Carbondale and from Lanesboro to Nineveh Junction, all of which were combined to become the D&H's famed and legendary Pennsylvania Penn Division. By the 1940s, the reliability and cost savings of diesel-electric locomotives over steam engines were undeniable, and the first diesel locomotive arrived on the D&H roster in May of 1944. The last steam locomotives dropped their fires on July 22, 1953. The black and yellow paint scheme that was carried over from the steam era was replaced in January of 1961 with a striking gray and blue lightning stripe scheme that became a defining characteristic of the D&H's motor power for the next 30 years. Passenger rail services across the United States began to hemorrhage money in the 1960s due to the completion afforded by the new airlines and the new interstate highway system. The federal government stepped in, forming Amtrak to take over interstate passenger rail services across the country. Amtrak declined to continue operations of the D&H's daytime Laurentian and overnight Montreal Limited, and these trains were discontinued effective on May 1, 1971. The first day of Amtrak operations. The 1960s were a decade of mergers and acquisitions in the United States railroad scene, and the D&H was not immune. On July 1, 1968, the D&H was acquired by Dureco, a subsidiary of the Norfolk and Western Railway. All assets of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Corporation were transferred to a new Dureco subsidiary, the Delaware and Hudson Railway Company. Several D&H branch lines were abandoned or sold off in the late 1960s and early 1970s as they succumbed to truck competition and the relocation of manufacturing facilities. The year 1973 was marked by the railroad's grand sesquicentennial celebration. A special train of historic displays was operated throughout the D&H system during April and May of that year, while excursions were operated for both employees and the public. In 1974, regular passenger trains returned to the D&H between Albany and Montreal. Amtrak's new Adirondack service, which followed the original route of the Laurentian and Montreal Limited, commenced operations on August 5, 1974, using D&H equipment and crews. This arrangement continued until March 1, 1977, when the D&H supplied equipment was replaced by Amtrak turboliners. Modern Amtrak equipment continues to operate the Adirondack route over the former D&H to this day. Meanwhile, the freight rail situation in the Northeast had deteriorated rapidly in the early 1970s, spurred by competition from trucks and overregulation from the government. By 1972, nearly every freight railroad surrounding the Delaware and Hudson was bankrupt and under the protection of the courts, which kept the railroads operating as vital public transportation services. As it had done with Amtrak, the federal government again stepped in, creating Conrail to take over the operations of 6 bankrupt railroads on April 1, 1976. As the Delaware and Hudson was the only remaining viable railroad in the Northeast, it was viewed as the necessary competition for the new Conrail system. As a result, the D&H was doubled in size overnight through the acquisition of the former Pennsylvania Railroad Wilkes-Barre branch and a variety of trackage rights agreements on the new Conrail system, allowing the Delaware and Hudson to directly serve several major terminals throughout the new Conrail system using Conrail's own tracks. While the expansion was lauded as a great opportunity for the D&H, a paint scheme change in September of 1977 indicated the reality of the situation. The classic lightning stripe scheme was simplified to a solid blue scheme to save money, as the railroad was massively overextended and bleeding money rapidly. Sadly, by 1980, the Delaware and Hudson was in dire financial straits. In 1981, Guilford Transportation Industries, owner of the Maine Central Railroad, signed an agreement to purchase the D&H. An influx of Guilford capital meant that the D&H was able to briefly revert to painting locomotives back into its classic lightning stripe scheme before taking on Guilford's charcoal and orange colors. Guilford acquired the Boston and Maine in 1983 and finally completed its purchase of the Delaware and Hudson Railway Company from Dureco on January 4, 1984, creating what was projected to become a strong and united New England rail network. However, it was not to be, as management disputes with labor, strikes, and the D&H's long-suffering finances posed insurmountable issues. The D&H declared bankruptcy on June 20, 1988. The New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railway was directed by the court to operate the D&H until a plan could be formulated. It was eventually decided to put the D&H up for sale, and on January 16, 1991, the entire Delaware and Hudson, spanning from Sunbury, Pennsylvania to Rouse's Point, New York, was sold to the Canadian Pacific Railway, then known as the CP Rail. The assets of the Delaware and Hudson Railway Company were transferred to the D&H Corporation, a new CP Rail subsidiary. Little by little, the D&H lost its independent identity in a sea of CP Rail red paint through the early 1990s. In the early 2000s, the D&H Corporation was merged into CP Rail entirely, and on September 18, 2015, the southern half of the D&H from Sunbury, Pennsylvania to Mechanicville, New York, was sold to the Norfolk Southern Railway, becoming that railroad's Sunbury line. CP Rail itself merged with the Kansas City Southern Railway on April 14, 2023, forming the CPKC. Today, the northern end of the former Delaware and Hudson Railway comprises a significant part of the CPKC network, providing access to the Port of Albany and portions of New England via interchanges in Mechanicville and Albany. It also forms an important route for American trade north into Canada along Lake Champlain. Similarly, the southern end of the D&H is a direct route for the Norfolk Southern freight moving east and west between Harrisburg and various New England connections. The physical line of the D&H therefore remains an important bridge line to the New England and Canada markets, serving much the same purpose today as it did when the famous D&H slogan was first conceived in the late 1930s. Today, most of the D&H's surviving employees are now enjoying their retirement from the railroad industry. However, their stories and memories of North America's oldest continually operated transportation company are now being preserved by me, by you, and by the hardworking volunteers of the many historical societies.